You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda Live. On the show today, given the high tax burden on Canadians and the current ethics crisis rocking the federal Liberals, many people are questioning the role of government. Just how big or small should it be? Right now, roughly 40 to 50% of your personal income goes to one tax or another, such as gasoline taxes, sales taxes, property taxes. The list goes on and on. And yet, despite all that taxation, there are huge gaping holes in our social safety net. Should taxes be even higher to pay for all of the services that Canadians want? Or do we need to live with less government service and more money in our pockets? What do you think? As always, the phones will be open to take your calls to hear what you have to say, so stay tuned. We're joined in studio this afternoon by Robert Metz. He's a founding member and the president of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. So how do you answer that question? Just how big, or I suppose how small, should government be in Canada?
I don't think that's the first question we have to ask ourselves. I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is government, and what makes government different from any other institution in society? And when you look at it that way, you look at government and you have to look at what is the one quality it has that no other institution, no individual, no group, nothing has. And that is the legal right to use force as the final arbiter.
Right.
And that is the distinguishing characteristic of government. So when we ask what is the purpose of government or what should government be doing, we have to ask what is the proper way to use force in society. And as far as I know, there's only one, and that's self-defense. So we create a government basically to protect our right to life, to liberty, and to property, and to provide a framework of laws and rules through which we can all behave as free individuals, making up our own decisions with respect to our own destinies. What we must never do is allow government to become an instrument of oppression, where some people are forcing their points of view on others and justifying it just because they say they're in the majority. That's not what a government of a free society is all about, because your freedom wouldn't last very long if we just kept on going on that principle.
Well, as a matter of fact, most Canadians assume that we live in a democracy in Canada, but Canada is anything but a democracy.
Well, I don't know about that. I would say we do live in a democracy.
Well, if you elect a majority government, they're given a five-year mandate to do basically whatever they want.
And they're not even a majority. They're just the largest minority.
Okay, yeah, that's a whole other show.
That's another show. But that again speaks to the fallacy of even the concept of majority rule. It's not really a majority rule. It's a minority rule by the largest minority. And again, that means, in effect, that, for example, federally, more people voted against Jean Chretien than voted in favor of him.
But that's a problem with our first past the poll system of electing governing officials. Yeah, but you're right. More people, something like 40% of Canadians voted for the federal Liberals, which means 60% voted against.
And then we're stuck with Liberal policies, even though the majority might not like that. So, but the issue is, what is the proper function of government? And that is just to basically administer justice and to protect everyone's individual right to choice. The big danger comes in with government when people start looking at government as an instrument for doing good. And that may sound counterintuitive in a way, because you're saying, well, no, government's there for the general welfare to help everyone do good. But remember what government is. Government is this instrument of force. And you cannot, quote, do good with an instrument of force when you're using it as an instrument of initiation of that force, of aggression. Like, I may have a very noble cause. Maybe I want to help somebody with a serious hospital operation or something, but I don't have the right to go down to my neighbor and point some weapon at them and say, listen, you hand over your money because I'm going to use it for a good purpose. Can you imagine if a complete society was based on that? what would happen to that society in the long run? Eventually, no one would be around to be helping that person who needs the help.
Well, our society essentially is based on that premise.
It is, and that's why we see ever-increasing taxes. We see an eventual breakup of the nation because you cannot sustain that kind of thing. We live in a society where basically it operates on the principle of robbing Peter to pay Paul and hoping that there's always more Peters than there are Pauls, but it's not working out that way. Eventually, all the people who perceive themselves as the payers eventually leave to another country or just won't produce as much, and then there's a general decline in the whole standard of living. You know, it always amazes me that internationally, globally, anywhere you look, the degree of individual freedom that any society or country has is exactly proportional to the degree of prosperity and well-being of everyone in that society, from bottom to the top. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people think that we should be redistributing wealth rather than having a system that creates more wealth. You know, it's like trying to build a building by taking the top floor off and always moving it to the bottom to help the people at the bottom, but the building never seems to get any taller. In fact, it starts getting a little shorter as time goes on. So that's not the approach. What you want to do is build upon what you have so that even those that we call, quote, poor are far better off than they would be in another system. We know very well in, for example, Canada and the United States, a person that's called poor here is almost wealthy by many standards in other nations. And when you look to why is that so bad in the other nations, it's because they lack freedom and individual incentive and all the economic rights that we do tend to take for granted.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that, but first we're going to take a short commercial break. Also, we're going to open our phone lines. The numbers to call in the Greater Toronto Area, 416-203-0302 or 905-332-3131. Welcome back to Rhonda Live. The question we're asking today, just how big, or I suppose how small, should government be in Canada? That's the provocative question we're asking today. Phone lines are open. The numbers to call 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Also, you can phone toll-free if you live outside the Greater Toronto Area. That number is 1-866-956-5555. We're joined in studio by Robert Metz. He's a founding member and the president of the Freedom Party of Ontario. And I guess when you start asking yourself the question of how big government should be, you have to ask yourself what role it should be playing and how much taxpayers should be willing to spend. And I can't help but think it's ironic that we're having this conversation today. On the front page of today's National Post, a story that has a lot of people talking. $2.6 million to give Rideau Hall a makeover. That's at the request of the Governor-General Adrienne Clarkson. That includes $29,000 for a dining room rug and a cool $43,000 for a rose garden. Your response?
Well, if that was all her own money that she earned on her own, I'd have not a single complaint about it. But because it was taxpayer dollars, it's symbolic of something, of a much larger picture. You know, I'm from London, Ontario. Right. And in London, Ontario, one of the big issues locally, and it's ironic because someone like Adrienne Clarkson would be a great champion of the government helping people who are ill and can't get along better. But we have a young lady who's a quadriplegic in London, Ontario. I think her name is Marlo Leatham. And it's been creating a great stir that she has had her assistance taken away from her by the government, you know, and they're thinking now that she might have to be institutionalized instead of living at home with her parents, which would end up being more expensive.
Right.
And yet here's a person who is in demonstrable need, very clearly needs that assistance, and is somehow nowhere to be seen on the list of government help. And it just sort of shows you where the government's priorities are, that they're more interested in getting votes than they are in actually helping people. You know, if government was really out there to help the people who were poor, we wouldn't have something like universality. I mean, people who are able to pay should be able to pay. Why when I go to a regular doctor's office for what's anywhere between a $20 and $40 visit, why shouldn't I pay that just for a checkup or something like that? Because that's where all the resources end up gone when you finally get down to the people that really need it for emergencies, which is what the idea of insurance was in the first place. It wasn't meant for day-to-day living. That's why the resources aren't there.
But what do you do, though? I mean, surely the government should be involved in providing some services that the private sector simply will not.
Well, the reason the private sector will not,
or perhaps cannot.
Well, well, first of all, no private sector or individual could possibly offer first dollar coverage in insurance because it would collapse on its own weight. The belief that government can do the same thing is equally as false, but the government seems to get away with it for a while because it doesn't have to earn its money. It just takes it by virtue of edict. It passes a law and it takes more money out of your pocket. It doesn't offer you anything directly in exchange. It doesn't even offer you a contract saying that we promise you that we will give you X, Y, and Z service, either medicine or whatever.
But look at all the things that we enjoy, though. We enjoy universal Medicare in this country. We enjoy education.
Well, maybe you do, but 900,000 Ontarians don't even have a family doctor.
We can send our kids to school. There's roads to drive on.
Well, then what do you say to the Marlow Leathams? What do you say to the 900,000 people who can't get a doctor because of the doctor shortage? You know, everyone works in their own self-interest. And that includes doctors, it includes nurses, it includes...
Socialists would say the answer is to spend more, tax more and spend more.
Well, that means that they have to pull that gun out and they have to point it at somebody else who may not agree with their point of view and say, you've got to support my point of view. I have nothing wrong with a, quote, socialist who has a point of view. He wants to live in a communal society if he did that on a voluntary basis, but that's not the definitive characteristic of socialism. Socialism begins with the use of force.
Right.
Because maybe for good purposes, again, but you cannot use an evil means to accomplish a good purpose. It just does not work. Morality does have a role in all of this, and it plays very strongly in government because the moral principle that government should be protecting is individual rights. And people say, well, that means you can do anything you want or free. No. Not at all. It actually limits your freedom. I mean, it's ironic to say that political freedom is a concept that limits one's freedom of action, but it does. And property rights are the defining place, so that, you know, I can make rules for my own home, but I can't make rules for your home, and vice versa. And as long as you live in a society like that, there's no reason for us to have a dispute, because we're not arguing over the same piece of property. The minute you have communal property, communal interest, communal anything, all of a sudden you see everybody arguing over it. And it's a source of a conflict because there's no clearly defined responsibility or accountability. It's easy, you know, that's why we don't see accountability in government, because there really isn't any. It's all diffused over this mass collective that nobody can really point a finger at one person. And there never really is one person to point it at. So much of the problems we have with government today are in, I think, you know, due to our own expectations of government. We should never expect, like, services. Healthcare and education, they can be provided by the private sector and should be. Government can help people access them, but keep them individually responsible for that. But it shouldn't be, quote, free in the sense that you pay nothing to go in there. That's self-defeating. Okay,
our phones are ringing. Let's go to Pam on line 1. Go ahead, Pam, you're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Pam, go ahead.
I think, firstly, I think that most Canadians don't necessarily have a problem with, you know, generally paying taxes to support our services. Right. And I don't think most Canadians are sitting around saying, okay, let's get rid of that service, but let's keep this service, and taking apart the government like that. I think the issue comes in whereas us average Canadians are sitting back and we're seeing, as we've seen these, especially these last few weeks, and even just earlier in the show about that article with Rideau Hall, our money's going places that we have not said, yeah, okay, that's wonderful, you know, spend $2.6 million fixing up somebody's house. Perhaps if we had a better system of checks and balances as to where our tax money is going, that would probably improve things greatly. You know, I mean, people have read different articles from the newspaper and such that different government officials get, you know, so many, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars for travel expenses and things like that. And I don't believe that necessarily the average Canadian taxpayer is mandating that as a part of running the government.
Yeah, Pam, thank you so much for your phone call. I like Adrienne Clarkson. I say God bless her. If she wants to spruce up Rideau Hall, God bless her. But I don't think most taxpayers want to spend over $2.5 million doing it, including $29,000 for a dining room rug.
You know, listening to Pam there, I agree that what she suggested would make things better, but it would not eliminate the problem. It's not enough to say that you can, I hate to use this word, but you can steal my money from me if you use it for something good. versus you can't steal
well,
my...
steal, that's a harsh word.
Well, it is a harsh word, but it has to be looked at that way because it's not a payment for a service received. In fact, what we call taxes today are really a taking from Peter and giving to Paul. For whatever reason, it's not a service rendered. If it were a service rendered, I'd call it a bill. I don't call my union gas bill a tax because it's determined by the amount of gas I use. I don't call my hydro bill a tax, even though it's got a monopoly and it's an artificially high price, but still I can regulate it by my own usage. I can't do that with respect to taxes. Taxes will keep growing irrespective of what I do. So eventually we find that Canadians, you know, the Fraser Institute always had this Tax Freedom Day. I mean, we were spending more than half the year at one point just working for the government. And that has a name, and we've used it historically. It's called slavery. And in history, slavery has not always been like the kings and queens whipping the harried slave. A lot of slavery has been sort of voluntarily accepted. It's a class structure. And then the slaves may even be well-pampered slaves. But nevertheless, that's their status because they do not have rights. The rights accrue to the people in government. When you hand over to the government your right to go to a doctor, I'm not allowed to walk into a doctor's office in Canada and take out my wallet and pay for my own service. That is only here in North Korea, I think, are the only two places in the world you can't do that. What is that all about? Is that supposed to be for my good? Come on. I mean, who's that help? I should be able to pay for my service, get out of the line, and let the guy who needs it more, you know, in behind me. But I'm not even allowed to do that. So, you know, and we always talk about lineups at hospitals. Well, that's only true in a socialist system. In a free market system, there are no lineups to speak of.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that. Sure. But first, we're going to take a short commercial break. Phone lines are open. You can call toll-free if you live outside the Greater Toronto Area. That number is 1-866-956-5555. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda Live. The question we're asking today, just how big or small should government be? Phone lines are quite busy today. The numbers to call 905-332-3131, 416-203-0302, or you can call toll-free outside the Greater Toronto Area. That number is 1-866-956-5555. Let's go right to Anne on line 5. Go ahead, Anne. You're on the air.
Hi, thanks very much. No, quoting things from the National Post and Fraser Institute is a joke, but I just wonder how many votes this man has ever received, because, frankly, I think he should run with the Alliance, because, you know, they're a party that wants to have a flat tax rate of 17%, and 17% would just be about right to cover the cost of the armies that'll have to patrol our neighborhoods, because the people that need operations will use, you know, any amount of force. Single mothers will rob me to get food for their children. I just think it's a ridiculous idea.
Anne, thank you so much for your phone call. How do you respond to that?
I'm not sure what she said was the ridiculous idea. I'm not saying anything. I'm saying that we should be based on a voluntary system instead of a system based on force. I think that's a good idea. I think a society...
We should voluntarily pay taxes?
It's been done.
Oh, Robert, nobody. Canadians are the politest people on earth. We're not good. Come on, Robert. No Canadian, as nice as we are, as polite as we are, no Canadian's going to voluntarily pay taxes.
In a sense, you don't voluntarily pay for your bills either, but it's an obligation you take when you accept the service. It's called trade for trade. And if the government provides me a service, I am obligated to pay for that service. I'm not arguing with that principle, but I'm saying that the government is now providing services that are not government services. They're not services that require an instrument of force to make them work. A school does not require to be run by force. A hospital should not be run by force. It should be run by market, quote, forces, which is a different kind of force. That's the force of people's individual choices. Each person...
it's not just individual choices. It's also driven by profit.
Yes.
In which case, you know, you talk about health insurance.
And what system isn't driven by profit? If you're not making a profit, you're making a loss, and you won't be there much longer.
Well, what do you do with
profit is your survival.
What do you do?
Profit is production, in fact.
What do you do with a person? You know, I lived for a time down in the United States, and what do you do with a person who, let's say, through no fault of their own, is born asthmatic, and because of that, can't access any health insurance whatsoever?
Well, it's like that person living up here who can't access the health care system often, just like this person who's a quadriplegic, who I would think would be at the very top of the list and can't get the health care service they need. So I'm always wondering why people are defending this system that doesn't work, that leaves 1 million Ontarians without a doctor, a family doctor, that's making our doctors want to leave, that every day I read about the healthcare system in crisis. I don't hear about that about any private hospitals because they operate on a profit and they don't turn away poor people. I know this from experience in the States, and I mean, it's just not like that. We believe a lot of myths up here about hospital systems. But again, getting back to the function of government, I do not think it's the primary function of government to run a hospital system. It's just not. If I'm running for politics, I'm running to run the government. I remember the last time I did run in an election, I'd go to an all-candidates debate, and I was being asked if I could guarantee that nurses would have enough tools in the operating room. I said, I can't guarantee that. I don't even know what tools you need. I know nothing about medicine. I'm not a doctor.
No.
I'm running for the government. I'm not running to run your hospital. We expropriate money. We give you the money. It's your responsibility what you do with it. So to expect politicians to run, especially these high-tech parts of our society, and expect it to work efficiently, it's not going to happen. And if the issue is to help the poor and the people that cannot help themselves, that's always a marginal issue. But it becomes the main issue when you live in a system of universality where there's nobody holding up the safety net, everybody's in it. There is no safety net. I'm in the safety net too. I get free medicine and I don't need it. Oh. So where's the justice in that? There's no justice in that. The people who are able are not supposed to be collecting off the system. And only the people who cannot make it on their own are supposed to be collecting off it. But we have universality, and you want to know why? Because it buys votes. Because people act in their own self-interest, and they're not, no matter all the nice things they tell you, they don't really care about the other guy. They care about themselves. They want to make sure that they're going to get that free health care, and they hope it's still going to be there if they've given it to all their friends.
Okay, our phone's so busy, Robert. Lots of people want to talk to you today. Let's go to Margaret on line 1. Go ahead, Margaret, you're on the air.
I would just like to say to this gentleman that when he pays with his money and goes ahead and the poor people go in line behind him.
There is no line.
That was the remark he made. And I'm most offended because then whatever is left, it's like, the master's table. And the crumbs that fall, you get it after he's been treated. I am quite offended by him.
Margaret, thank you so much for your phone call. Your response, Robert?
Well, again, I'm trying to clear the way for her, and she's offended that I'm making room for her. That doesn't make sense to me. The assumption is, we've learned to live, because we have socialized medicine, that we have lineups at hospitals. This does not exist where you don't have socialized medicine. There are no lineups. You walk in, you can get an MRI in 5 minutes. In Canada, you may have to wait for months. So I don't see why anybody would want the people who are able to get out of that line not to get out of it. I mean, that's why every country has tried socialist medicine, eventually goes two-tier and begins a process of privatization, even though they continually lie to the public and say, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to maintain our healthcare system. You'll get free care, but it privatizes anyway. So, I mean, ma'am, you can get mad at me for telling you the truth, but that's the way it is. And no matter what the other political parties tell you, they're going to continue privatizing too, because they know that you won't have any health care if they don't. It's as simple as that.
Let's go to Anita on line 4. Go ahead, Anita. You're on the air.
Hi, Rhonda.
Hi, Anita.
My comment is I am angered by the amount of taxes the government is taking from us.
Yeah, me too.
That's the one that gets me. Yeah. I don't get anything for it.
I really believe that we're being oppressed, robbed, and controlled. I agree with a lot of the things your guest is saying. My husband comes home with half a paycheck, and the average person these days, both people have to work just to make ends meet. And I really believe that this is a problem that's spiraling out of control. I believe they're going to keep taking more and more taxes from us, and instead they're going to, make us oppressed.
Yeah, Anita, thank you so much for your phone call. As a matter of fact, we're facing a huge surplus, far larger than anyone had ever predicted it was going to be. And what are the feds doing? Instead of just using it to pay down our massive, massive national debt, they're looking at ways to spend it, to expand programs, to create new programs.
There's an election coming. They have to buy our votes with our own money. You know, it used to be once said that it was not proper to pay for people for their votes, but now they buy our votes with our money, and I think that's even worse. But you know, there's an old saying that says that the society that values security more than it values freedom will lose both, whereas a society that values freedom more than security will gain both. And that's very true, because security comes from freedom, from the choices that we make and from the productivity we create, so that there's a greater abundance for all. We must never be envious of people who have something that we don't have, because when we do that, we destroy the system of productivity. We can't be going after them because they earned something and we didn't. Whether it's our fault or not, that's not the issue. That's absolutely not the issue. The issue is that we have to respect the rights of our fellow citizens, let them be productive, and then everyone's better off. It always works that way.
Robert Metz, our time is gone, but thank you so much for joining us. It's always fun talking to you.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. A couple phone lines open right now. The numbers to call in the GTA, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Today, the question we're asking, provocative question, just how big or small should government be in Canada? Joining our conversation, Adrienne Snow. She's the Managing Director of the Centre for the Study of Civic Renewal. Adrienne, thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
You're welcome.
Do you think government has grown too large in Canada? Particularly now, we're faced with this huge federal surplus, and instead of paying down the debt or giving, Canadians some of their tax dollars back, the Liberals are looking at ways to expand spending. Oh, we have more money, so let's grow bigger.
Quite honestly, I think this actually breaks down quite nicely into two separate questions. And I think one of the problems for policymakers and for the folks in Ottawa these days is disentangling these two strands of thought. One question is, how big should government be? What kind of role should it play in our society and in the economy? And when you're talking about that, you're really asking a question about what services can it provide better than the private sector? What can it do that people can't do for themselves? What should it attempt to do, and what has it been shown to be a failure at? Then there's a second question, which is how large a tax burden are Canadians prepared to carry or able to carry?
We're at about 40 or 50% right now.
And there is some relationship between those two things, obviously. But one of the problems we're facing right now is that Canada's national debt is so immense that Canadians are now being taxed very heavily at 40 to 50% overall, as you correctly point out, in large measure because they're paying for spending that the government undertook in the past. And that's a huge problem. So before we start looking at spending surpluses or reducing taxes radically, although I do think it's important to see taxes continue to come down some more in the next 5 to 10 years if we're to continue to stimulate economic growth, there is a huge need at this point, I think, for the federal government to simply pay down that debt, which neither reduces the size of government, nor will it have a huge impact on our taxes in the short term, but in the long run it will pay off.
So what services should the government be in the business of providing?
That's a difficult question, and political philosophers and economists and anyone else you want to canvass on this issue all have differing perspectives. I think your last guest took a fairly classical libertarian perspective and suggested that really the only room for government is in areas such as policing, defense, and questions of law and order. I would argue that maybe in some far distant future day, our economy will have become so prosperous through technological change, through the hard work of our citizens, and continuing investment both in education and in capital development, that we may be wealthy enough that we'll be able to whittle back government largely, though never entirely, to those functions. As an example of a program or a service that I think the private sector would never provide particularly well or has little incentive to do so, employment insurance is something that is probably better provided when we all pay collectively into a national insurance pool that protects each and every one of us in case of job loss, except of course for the self-employed, which I am, but right. Theoretically it's a good public good. Healthcare.
Although if the private sector could take over employment insurance as it exists right now, I think there'd be a lot of takers because it's generating a huge surplus because something like only 38% of everyone who's paying into it can ever collect.
I think probably there's a case to be made for private administration of programs like employment insurance.
But if it were a volunteer program, who would opt into such a program? That if you have a claim, you lose your job, you may or may not be able to.
Correct. So there is at least some
70% chance of your claim being denied.
Well, there is at least some role for government in making sure that there's a collective pool of insurance. Whether they're doing a good job of administering that fund, and you just pointed out that they aren't necessarily, is a different question. Similarly with healthcare and education, there is a lot of room, I think, for private provision of service in those areas, particularly in healthcare. Not for any ideological reason, which I think your last guest might have been promoting as the reason for doing these things, but for practical reasons. I do actually think that in many areas, private hospitals, private health facilities of various kinds may provide a higher level of service while cutting costs, simply because business people always have a keen eye for the bottom line and are always looking for ways to pare back costs so that we're not spending tax dollars in health unnecessarily. That said, I think there will always continue to be a role for the government and probably for the federal government in regulating healthcare and ensuring that access to healthcare is more or less equal across the country.
All right, let's go to George on line 4. Go ahead, George, you're on the air.
Hi, how are you today?
Hi, George, I'm fine. Go ahead.
Well, I think that, I've noticed that you're making a lot of comments about the federal government. One thing that you're forgetting about is the provincial government. I live here in Barrie, Ontario, and I've been an injured worker now since August of '99. I haven't been able to work, and I've been told I'll never be able to work again using my arms. And this is according to 3 different doctors, including an orthopedic surgeon. And yet for the last 2 years, I haven't received a cent from the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board here in Ontario. I've been doing some checking into it, and the president and CEO of WSIB is now making a whopping salary of $900,000 a year. And if he was to quit, get fired, retire, whatever, lose his job tomorrow, he's guaranteed $250,000 a year for the rest of his life.
Wow.
My situation is so pathetic that I never know from month to month if I'm going to be able to pay my rent and my hydro. Food, well, that's another story altogether. I've had to go shoplifting for food, and I mean at least a half a dozen times I've had to go shoplifting for food. I've had to go to food banks. We have a charity here in town called St. Vincent de Paul. I've had to go to them to get food vouchers. We've had to go hungry at times. We never know from one day to the next, what's going to go on, if we're going to be able to pay our rent or anything else.
George, I want to stop you there. I want to thank you so much for your phone call because I want to give Adrienne a chance to respond to that. What do you do with the most vulnerable members of our society, the people like George?
Without knowing the specifics of George's situation, it's difficult to comment on his particular experience. It sounds to me like what he's saying is that he actually thinks that the social safety net is not big enough or strong enough, and that he feels he's fallen through it.
Well,
now, my question would be...
It was supposed to be. I mean, it was, the safety net was built in the first place to handle people like George.
Well, I'm not suggesting, I'm not saying whether I think it is large enough or not. His experience seems to suggest that he thinks that he hasn't been provided with adequate protection. I guess my question would be, would he have been willing when he was working to pay more tax to ensure that there were more protections in place for him now that he's fallen upon hard times? These are questions that we as a society have to decide collectively. I think there's room for a lot of public debate. I hope that before the Chretien government moves to spend the surplus or to reinvest it in the debt, whatever, or to give us further tax reductions, that they will look towards a process of very open public consultation, bringing in ordinary citizens like George who can speak to some of the failures of the system personally, organizations like mine that take a slightly more academic, analytical approach to some of these things, and try to get a sense of what the consensus among Canadians is, whether they think we need greater protection provided by government, whether turning to the St. Vincent de Paul Society, which is a private safety net of kinds, is the way to go, or whether we need to continue with some combination of the two.
But I guess the question you have to ask, how much higher could Canadian taxes possibly go if we're already spending collectively 40 to 50% of our entire income on one tax or another, be it gasoline tax, sales tax, property taxes, income tax, provincial tax?
This is an excellent question. I mean, there is a considerable body of academic research out there that shows that there's something called the dead weight loss of extra taxation, which is to say that for every extra dollar Canadians are paying in taxes these days, you're taking a dollar that could have been potentially much more productively either spent by the individual in things they need or saved and invested building future growth of the economy into our system, and instead you're bleeding it off into a bureaucratic process where much of the value of that dollar is lost before it reaches the end user. So ideally we should, I think, to bolster the country's long-term economic prosperity, be looking to cut taxes now. Unfortunately, we're essentially paying for the sins of the past 30 or 35 years, which is how we racked up this massive debt I was mentioning earlier, and it's people like George who are getting caught in the crossfire on that. And, you know, if nothing else, I think we need to see a commitment from every single federal politician to reduce the debt and never again to return to the days of running deficits year after year after year, because it's simply not a sustainable way of running a government.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. Adrienne Snow, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure talking to you.
You're very welcome.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Just a couple phone lines open right now. I want to hear your thoughts as well, and we'll get to more of your phone calls when we come back right after these messages. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Rhonda Live. The question we're asking today, just how big should government be in Canada? And with his thoughts on this, we're joined in studio by Bruce Vogt. He's a spokesperson for the group Citizens for Public Justice. Bruce, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
How do you answer that question? Just how big should government be in Canada? And I suppose the corollary to that question is it too big now?
I think the question we have to address is how effective should government be? And I think the questions of big or small follow from that question of how effective government should be. Our organization has always seen government sort of having a role to play in 4 different areas. It plays a role as an arbitrator. Right. It plays the role to make, it fills a vacuum in society when services aren't being covered properly. I think it also has a job to make sure that different sectors in society, business, labor, individuals live up to their responsibilities as citizens and as different community groups. And as well, it plays the enforcement role. So I think that's the way to evaluate the government. And then from there, you can ask the question, is it effective? And then maybe we can start asking questions, is it too big or is it too small?
Well, is it effective? We have more than 1 million children living in poverty in Canada. Right. So how do you answer the question in light of that woeful statistic?
Well, in light of that statistic, you would say the government is not being effective. And it could be, and it should be, because it has the resources to do so. It becomes a question of priorities. Where have they put the resources that they do have? And why haven't they applied them to children living in poverty? Because in actuality, if they take the initiative now while children are still young, they're investing in children. And later on, as these children grow older, they're no longer a burden to society because they've been able to be fed, they've been able to be educated, and then they can become good contributing members of society and only stimulate growth in society.
Probably the most accurate measurement of the size of government, or how big it should be, is how big the tax burden is on Canadians. So Bruce, you, me, we're spending about 40 to 50% of every dime that we make. Every dollar that we make is going to one form of tax or another. Can we afford, as average Canadian taxpayers, can we afford to go higher than that?
A difficult question. I mean, I think initially if you ask anybody, do you want to pay less taxes? Of course, we all like to pay less taxes. Who wouldn't?
Yeah, I'd like to pay less tax.
I guess the question again is how effective is the taxes being used? I remember my father saying to me, who differs from me in terms of my political views, he's saying, I don't mind paying taxes. I just want to make sure they're being paid well. And when we see...
Does that include a $29,000 dining room rug for Adrienne Clarkson?
Well, my initial reaction, you know, as a tax-paying citizen would be, hey, hold on, what's going on here? I don't know all the facts. I don't know whether these things need replacing. But then I would ask that question in light of what you asked earlier. Can we reasonably spend that money in light of the fact that we have 1 million children in Canada living below the poverty line?
And we have a massive national debt, too.
And we have a massive national debt. So how do you find a way to make sure that the services are adequate for people who need the services and at the same time pay down the debt? I think the two things have to happen concurrently. The question is whether or not one thing is happening over against the other thing that should be happening.
Okay, our phone's so busy. Let's go to Kelvin on line 1. Go ahead, Kelvin, you're on the air.
To go.
Hi, Kelvin.
Hello. I agree with this gentleman here. I apologize, I didn't catch his name. That it's a question of effectiveness,
right?
And not so much is it too big or too small. That may become an issue afterwards. And I think it's a question of educating the people and the government to be better managers, especially when it comes to business issues. I think it's a matter of bad business.
Right, Kelvin, thank you so much for your phone call. I'm sure there's a lot of disillusioned Canadians right now with the big ethics crisis that is rocking the federal Liberals. A lot of Canadians are feeling very disillusioned with the whole political system and the process.
And I think government has done that to themselves, not only because of this situation, but also because both at the federal and provincial level, we've had governments that have talked about trying to get out of the business of being government. They've talked about it's time to shrink the government.
Right.
I mean, we had the former Premier of Ontario talking about government, we're in government to be out of government in a sense.
Right.
They were almost anti-government. You saw them reduce the seats from 130 in Ontario to 103. Now, that's not necessarily a bad or a good thing.
But we also saw them give themselves double-digit pay increases.
Exactly. And so this is where the cynicism grows. I think the challenge here is to recognize and realize there is a positive role for government in society, because I think we all do. We need our roads. We need we need assurances that there will be a healthcare system. We need assurances that there will be places where we can get educated. And so we want to make sure that those things are in place, but that they're done effectively.
Well, you say it's important that the government doesn't need to do everything.
That's right.
It just needs to ensure that everything gets done.
Exactly.
Explain that.
Well, for example, the education debate, for example. Should all education be something that is only handled publicly? Here in Ontario, we have both a separate and a public system, and then we have other systems that, independent systems that exist outside of that don't necessarily get the funding that these other systems do. My challenge to the government would be that if these other schools meet the criteria that's in place for educating people responsibly, should they not then get full funding for those situations? And I think that's a matter of discussion. So let's talk about what can be done by people privately and what can be done by the government, and how should the government regulate what's going to occur privately, because the government still has that role. The government still has to make sure that things are going to get done.
All right, let's go to Elizabeth on line 2. Go ahead, Elizabeth, you're on the air.
Hi. I agree a lot with what this gentleman is saying. I think that a lot of things need to be done to properly regulate things across the board.
Right.
It's basically, I just think that we need to address that kids get what they need.
Right. And
that basically, my concern is with youth turning around, committing crimes, assaulting people because, one, they don't have the educational skills or anything to get a job, and they just don't know how to cope. They don't know how to do anything. And if they come from backgrounds with poverty kind of, it's a vicious cycle. Poverty kind of leads to more poverty in a lot of cases, because these kids and these people don't have the resources or anything to be able to get themselves out, and there's a lot of internal cycles.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your comments, and you brought up some good points, because there is a cyclical nature to poverty, that it just feeds on itself, and it's very difficult to break that cycle. You know, it's one thing, I guess, Bruce, to talk about individual freedoms, and I should have the right to do this, and I should have the right to do that, and I shouldn't have to pay to help you go to school. But collectively, as a society, we all benefit when all of our members are doing well.
I think you're absolutely right. We forget that we have a common humanity. We live in community with each other.
And whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it or not. And we're going to live in that community with differences. It's not a matter of giving people handouts without a situation where they don't have to do something for themselves. It's a situation of providing people the same thing that you and I had. We had a good education. We had a secure home. We were well fed. There's many people that live in poverty that don't have any of that. So they're already 2 or 3 steps behind where you and I began.
Right.
And it's recognizing that. I don't understand what it means to live in poverty. I can only read about it.
Right.
But those are significant barriers that people have to have some help in getting over. And then from there, they can become productive, full members of society. And that only helps us in the end. Because again, we all live in community with each other.
And if government doesn't do it, who is going to? The private sector?
I don't think the private sector will do, and I would have to differ with the earlier guest on that. I think if you reduce us all to individuals that have no relation with each other, we might just slip into anarchy.
Bruce Vogt, our time is gone, but thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We'll be right back with news from our medical files after these messages. Stay tuned. Don't go away. I'll be right back with a preview of what's coming up on the next show right after these messages. Stay tuned. That's our show for today. Thanks for watching. On the next Rhonda Live, Barry Siskind will be here. He's the author of the new book, Bumblebees Can't Fly. He has developed 7 strategies of common sense, strategies that can turn your life around. A look at the not-so-common aspects of common sense. That's next time on Rhonda Live. Hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great day.
This is CTS.